Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guests today are Sean Pupanich. He is the Senior Solutions Architect at AWS, and Richard Breakiron is Senior Director for Strategic Initiatives for America's Federal Sector at Commvault. Good to have you both with us, gentlemen.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So many agencies are moving and investing in cloud services and thinking about moving to cloud services or maybe doing cloud native services as they deploy new applications. But cloud is not just a way of operating, it's also a major investment. And in the moving from the capital expenditure to the operating expenditure model that so many agencies are seeking. And so it's important to be able to optimize, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So Sean, I'm going to throw you the first question. Simply is, what challenges do you think agencies are facing when they've got this hybrid environment with big cloud investments, big cloud facilities hosting them, but they also have their own data centers and even edge computing facilities that might be smaller?
So if you look at government, it's very good at building long-lived, stable institutions, and so in some ways, government IT has mirrored that, and so you'll have applications that have been running for 20 and 30 years. Where the challenges come in is when there is a significant change. So this is a change in the technology stacks. This is a change in kind of what drives priority. So it used to be, the biggest threat to, operating your infrastructure was a hurricane, a natural disaster of some type, an earthquake. Now cyber attacks have become a much more significant factor, almost more than any other threat. And the ability for attacks to come from both inside and out have increased. And so governments and agencies have had to become more dynamic, be able to update these older systems, be able to change their architecture and their security, and moving into an environment where they're not solely responsible for all the hardware changes gives them that added flexibility. If you look at a traditional agency that's running, at least 2 data centers, they're often either having to have staff shuttle between those 2 locations to make changes to each location, or they have kind of a unbalanced staffing of the 2 locations where, one location is really where they're doing their primary changes and building of their most advanced systems, and the other side is more of a backup and kind of disaster recovery space, and so it doesn't quite get the same attention that the primary does. And so working in more of a hybrid environment, it allows you to have your staff focus on what they do best at their primary location, and gives you that consistent virtual environment to expand. That's easier to maintain than something like a secondary data center or even an edge location.
And Richard, let's ask you then. We've seen a lot of challenges then. There's the cybersecurity challenge, there is the personnel challenge, the talent challenge, the still having some capital expenditure things to worry about that Sean laid out. Can the hybrid cloud approach mitigate these particular challenges, do you think?
Hey, well, thanks, Tom. And I personally think that every agency, every organization always does a little bit of a hybrid to begin with. You don't swap out, everything at one time. You sort of move a little bit more graciously. You put your toe in the water with cloud, you move some data up there. Okay, that worked. And then you start moving forward, which is the right way to integrate a technology. But what hybrid is really talking about is, in my mind, it is recognizing there are processes, there are people, and there are technology that you've always got to evaluate as you integrate and improve business processes. I always think of the reason you go to cloud is you wanted operational resiliency. You wanted to build this ability to scale without having to say, oh my God, I have to go out and do a contract, get a whole new set of infrastructure for my on-prem solution. Hey, it just automatically takes care of it. So there's some dynamics there that you've got to recognize. But in my mind, especially when you have an unexpected event, think COVID, and now you have an entire workforce that is working remotely. If you're working on-prem, you're actually not only constrained by the resources that are on-prem, but your ability to reach them through the network. Cloud takes care of so many of those things. Now, there's a reverse edge to that too. So, and the reason some people are always going to keep a little bit on-prem, I think the federal government, they have classified environments that they've got to manage. They've got, simple activities, say a print server. Why would you necessarily send print all the way up into the cloud and all the way back? There are a lot of good reasons to do it too, but these are some of the dynamics that I see the advantage of a hybrid. You're always going to migrate from the on-prem to the cloud, and it's always going to be a blend for a while. Very rarely do you have, but I think you're going to see more and more startups that they start in the cloud, and that's where they live. So,
and you mentioned those black swan events such as the pandemic, and that not only changed the environment in terms of where people were working and accessing systems, but it also spawned a whole lot of brand new mass scale programs that the government was offering to the public. And it's hard to see how they could have even had those had they been trying to build data center capacity under their own roofs.
AWS did that major COVID test launch.
What was interesting about COVID in terms of government adoption of cloud services is it brought a lot of new customers to the table for cloud, ones that weren't necessarily interested or considering cloud at that time, but there was a necessity to find a solution that could be rapidly deployed and scale to a large audience. And so they were kind of forced to consider cloud. And fortunately, we're very successful in a lot of those early endeavors, turning around things within a matter of weeks or months, things that, they wouldn't have even had the hardware procured by the time they had these things launched, especially at that time when we were seeing shortages across the industry. So it showed kind of a unique situation that really showed an outsized advantage for cloud, but then it also kind of opened their minds up to, okay, well, what else can we do here? How else can we benefit from leveraging these services and this kind of dynamic scale where we need it?
Sounds like the company that can handle Black Friday Christmas sales and ramp up hugely can also handle something like payroll protection plan.
Yeah. And if you look at the scale that for example, AWS operates at, we handle, internet scale, things like Netflix or Twitter. But we also handle startups, 5-man teams. And so they all get the same tools, and that's true of government. So your largest government agency and institution, with all the best practices and capabilities that they have, small local government has access to the same tools. So it's kind of this great equalizer.
And when you do go in the cloud, whether new natively as a small company or adopting some legacy applications and facilities to the cloud for the first time, it does change the way you look at security, as you mentioned earlier, also the way you handle data. Simply deduplicating might become more important, for example, to reduce the instances and the cost of having lots of copies of the same thing. Storage, backup, all of this changes in the cloud. What are some of those changes? What are some of the best practices to ensure that that investment works for you, performance-wise and cost-wise, given some of those technical functions?
Yeah, so I mean, you do kind of have a little bit of a trade-off between performance and efficiency. So it depends on what scale you're looking at. So if you are looking at that internet scale, being able to send COVID tests out to the entire U.S. population, then you're not deduplicating in that instance. You're using something like object storage that can scale massively into terabits per second. Whereas if you're doing traditional IT workloads, like let's say you have a network attack storage, user file share, something like that, then you do want to maximize your efficiency. You have kind of a known limit of, how many people are going to be using that, what your typical growth rate is going to be. So it's much more manageable. You're not going to get, 80 million users, start using it overnight, right? So then you can optimize around efficiency, use things like deduplication, compression, compaction, to kind of get those storage costs down and make sure that you're not, wasting additional storage when people are sharing a lot of similar files or working on a lot of similar documents.
Right. So basically, the management challenges of the data and of the technical facilities are the same. You're just using different tools because you're in the cloud and not in your own data center.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So for a lot of the traditional IT workloads, it's very, very similar to how you would operate on-prem. You get a little more flexibility in that you're not going through these like 5-year buy cycles. So if you do need to scale up or scale down, that can be a daily decision. So we do see a lot of cost optimization happening just by letting some workloads run and then seeing that they're underutilized and then scaling them down a little bit and then continuing to allow them to run and just saving money based on that. You had asked a little bit about security as well, I think. And so security at a basic level is also very similar. You know, you're using a lot of the same best practices. You want least privilege access. You always want to make sure you have some level of immutable data in the event of something like a cyber attack or a ransomware event. And what we have seen as a trend and a lot of interest that's growing is more towards this zero trust aspect of things. And so that means something a little bit different depending on the organization. But certainly DoD has been leading the way in terms of what that means for government.
Okay. And Richard, let's get to a real nitty gritty issue here with respect to management and optimization of your cloud investment. And that is egress costs for data. This comes up time and time again when talking with federal customers, is that, yeah, it's free to put the data, so to speak, up into the cloud, costs money to get it down. And so they're looking for architectures and application setups to try to minimize that. What are some of the best practices for making sure you don't lose performance, but also maximize the investment by minimizing egress costs?
That's a great question, and it's one we hear all the time at Commvault, and we sort of call it the power of and so what we really describe is as you go from your hybrid and you go into the cloud, wouldn't it be nice that you could just have no egress charge, that you could sort of have unlimited storage, unlimited time, and have that type of capability integrated in the contract? And so, at least for Commvault, we said if that's what the market wants, let's give them that, and so we built that. So my comment, every time you do any type of risk management with technology implementation, do a well-developed plan. Go do your research to begin with. Go find out who's out there, what they're offering. Hey, does your company have experience with AWS? Do they have experience with being able to take on-prem, migrate it up in the cloud, and also make sure that there's no loss, but also that if something occurs where you have to bring it back, to do things like analytics, to do other AI, like for JADC2, or if you're in a deployed environment, like in the DoD, hey, can I manage this across the entire framework where I have to operate? And so our comment is find people that have already learned that. Find the people that and industry that allows you to support that. Very similar to what Sean just described. If you are looking at a architecture that you've got to go to, security, zero trust, then you ought to find and make sure up front as part of your planning process, ask those questions, ask the hard questions, and don't be afraid. The other part is, at least I've learned, and I think Sean would say as well, if you're finding a company that says, hey, I can do it all, probably not the right partner. You want somebody that has a well-collected group of partnership, because Commvault might be the industry leader, as Gartner says, for data backup, recovery, and data management. But when it comes to, hey, who's the best cloud provider, they're going to say, hey, that's AWS. Okay, do these two companies work well together or not? Do they have a history together? Do they know how to work that? The last piece that Sean also touched on, and you mentioned as well as Tom, was, okay, I can scale up and I can scale down. What people forget, though, is that's a new skill. I've got to learn, I've got to train IT personnel on, hey, as I scale up, does it automatically scale down? Or do I have to learn how to scale down? Do I have to tell the cloud, I open up my doors at 6 a.m. in the morning, I shut down at 6 p.m.? Does it then keep running all midnight through midnight if I don't tell it to turn off? So there are some skills and abilities that you've got to learn to make sure that your ability is fully operationally resilient, because obviously customers can be global when you think of it. That's the beauty of cloud. But you've got to make sure that that you've minimized your constant use of compute potentially up in the cloud. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, so you really have to do some careful planning almost on an application by application basis, because to the cloud, everything is data. Whether you're moving a set of containers, say, to redeploy somewhere else, that to the wires looks like data, different from, say, a database that you're calling on through an API to power an application and get an answer, say, for a transaction. So again, that looks like data to the wire also. So really, it's not so much a matter of there's a way that you can blanket approach all of this, but you really need to do your homework application by application, instance by instance.
Yeah, I think that's a great analysis. And if you also look at the other aspect of today's digital transformation, it used to be if there was an outage 20, 30 years ago in an information system, you'd look for the cable or the radio system or whatever that went out, the modem. But remember now, in an internet world and a digital world, data finds its best path. It is not a predetermined path. It goes where it can. So when you've got to also have part of the planning to make sure you know how to troubleshoot when things go a little bit sideways. Different skills again.
And I want to get back to that security and access question. Sean, you mentioned some of those things earlier. And can you actually improve access in the cloud? Because people are not accessing any one thing necessarily. As Richard said, there's many pathways, and the application that a given user is accessing could be in any of several or several of physical locations. And then the zero trust comes into this, which seems to mitigate in favor of a distributed approach, which is different from when the data center is your hard shell that you've got everything, all your security measures surrounding.
Yeah, so before, zero trust was really a thing, cloud security was already super high priority, right? They were trying to think of how can we take this huge range of customers, right? Commercial sector, government, people with high security needs, people with lower security needs, and manage that. So when you look at the flexibility of building out networks and security in a cloud environment, it aligns very well with a lot of zero trust principles to begin with. Where some of the challenges come in is when you're starting to bring in legacy applications and legacy network architectures, and then trying to make that zero trust. So that's where a cloud environment allows you to refactor and kind of break apart your network in a much more granular way. So you can have, any number of accounts, any number of smaller networks that you can build. And so when you bring that over, if you're building your own applications, then it makes it fairly easy. If you're trying to apply zero trust to existing applications and infrastructure, then a lot of times you're using some combination of cloud infrastructure to build the base of that. But then you also need additional access control and security software that will layer on top of that and give you kind of that granular access to those existing resources. So you just don't have like this, one single network perimeter, you VPN in and you have access to everything. You're using some kind of partner software to allow people to give access. That software identifies what this individual has access to, and then only grants to those specific resources. And that can be through the cloud. And it can also even delegate through a hybrid of cloud and existing on-prem resources. So one of the things we saw COVID in the kind of remote work bump is that sort of approach is where you're taking all the external access. You're no longer using just a plain VPN, you're using something more granular, and then you're able to delegate access between cloud resources and existing data center resources.
And Richard, when you access anything, it's ultimately data that people want. And so I know that you've got the notion that operational readiness really centers around the data. Maybe for a final comment, tell us more about that one.
So that's really been such a evident comment throughout all the conferences I've gone to within the DoD, within federal space. Operational readiness has always been about creating actual insight and being able to make a decision and create an opportunity or remove a threat. In the DoD space, recent comment by General Morrison was exactly that line. Data readiness is underpinning operational readiness. If we cannot maintain our access to the data, be it in the cloud or be it in a deployed tactical unit, then many of the systems that we are now totally moved to a digital world are going to be a constraint rather than a positive. So you've got to be able to think about that. You've got to be able to recognize and be able to look at your data realistically and realize, as he further spoke, depends on the phase of the operation. When you're in phase 0 and getting ready to deploy, logistics data streams might be much more important than the weapon system. Phase 3 of the battle, and you're actually engaged, hey, I better make sure my weapon systems and my battlefield intelligence systems are full up and ready and everybody has access to them. So I think that's the balance. And you've got to take that common sense approach, but the focus really is, what are your business operations, financial, HR? In the case of DoD, I've sort of outlined engagement in activities around the world, be they active combat or be they rescue operations in support of recent events like with Ian. So I think that's where I hear that all the time, and it keeps getting reiterated as a priority.
All right, you've both given us quite a bit to think about. I want to thank today's guests. Richard Breakiron is the Senior Director for Strategic Initiatives for America's Federal Sector at Commvault, and Sean Pupanich is a Senior Solutions Architect at AWS. I'm Tom Temin. You're listening to Federal News Network. Let's go back to the studio now for more on the Industry Exchange Cloud.